Resolved, that we adhere to the doctrine that all men are born free and equal, not because it is a sentiment solemnly declared by our fathers, in defense of which they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, but because it is, as declared by them, a self-evident truth, applicable to every age and to every race, and those only who have sacrificed their convictions on the altar of ambition or self-interest would deprive the African of his God-given birthright.
Hi, I'm Ranger Chuck Arning with the National Park Service here in the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. And as I look back at the time period before the Civil War and the written words of the people who participated in those events, I'm impressed with the great passion, commitment, and intensity of feeling. Can you imagine, for example, on the floor of your town meeting or from the pulpit of your church, a debate raging on national policy? And yet, with the passage of the Second Fugitive Slave Act as part of the Compromise of 1850, such debates were common. And it was not only part of your political landscape, you could also find it within your religious communities as well, with equal intensity. This debate on slavery raged on, splintering communities, fracturing congregations, and ultimately leading America to its crucible of fire. And remember, friends, the northern economy was dependent upon the southern economy. Remember, here in the Blackstone Valley, we were textile mills. We were mills that manufactured the machinery that operated the textile process. Yes, a paradox, because the cotton necessary for the textile process was dependent upon a slave labor force. Slavery was an ingredient that we all were bound up in. So join me as we locate those final Underground Railroad sites here in the Blackstone Valley, understand the chasm in American society, find out who these radical abolitionists were, and follow the African on the road to freedom.
Textile mill owners and merchants and men of business, men whose first priority was business and not social causes, found the abolitionists to be very annoying because they, with their logic of justice and their rhetoric of revolution in many senses, they tended to disrupt the normal ebb and flow of business. Textile mills needed cotton. Ship captains and ship owners of Cape Cod and all throughout southern New England were often involved in exporting southern cotton. So many northern men of business were associated with the institution of slavery, albeit 2 or 3 times removed, but their fortunes nevertheless rested on the fundamental institution of slavery. So they found the abolitionists to be quite a thorn in their side.
Now, just who were these abolitionists, these agitators, these folks stirring up all this trouble here in the Blackstone Valley? Well, for one thing, they were deeply religious. And many of them were avowed pacifists, believing in the power of the spoken word to change the evil in a man's heart. However, there were also a few who were more willing to take violent means to achieve their ends of freeing the African from bondage. They were deeply religious in all their pursuits, and they pursued those moral reforms such as temperance, women's rights, as well as the abolition of slavery. And there's one other thing they had in common. Abolitionists had great tenacity. They just didn't give up.
I tend to date the real start of the abolitionist movement to the publication of the first edition of William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, This is in January 1831. In the first year of the publication of The Liberator, Garrison had 6 subscribers. The next year he had 53. By the mid-1850s, he had thousands of subscribers, many of them right in the area where we're sitting in southern New England, in the Blackstone River Valley. This area became a hotbed of abolitionist sentiment.
The practical Christian socialists of Hopedale were as vehemently against the abolition of slavery as they were avowed pacifists. And as part of a tradition within the commune, they began to celebrate August 1st in commemoration of the abolition of slavery in the British West Indies. And since independent thought was so highly thought of and praised here in the commune, anyone of any reputation within the abolition movement would come here to Hopedale to speak. Some noted lecturers as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Abby Kelly, Stephen Foster, Samuel May Jr., and the list goes on of notables who would come here to Hopedale to preach the end of slavery. As part of the celebration, it was common for members of the audience to step forward and proclaim their outrage against slavery. On one occasion, a man stepped forward and held up his palm for all to see, for cut into the human flesh of his hand were burned the letters SS, for slave stealer. This gentleman had journeyed to the South to assist Africans escaping their bondage and had been captured and thusly branded. And that branding and that image of that man with his hand up before all must have made an incredible image upon 11-year-old Anna Thewig, who later, as a member of the Ladies' Sewing Society of Hopedale, would write about it in Hopedale Reminiscences, published in 1910. As a matter of fact, it appears that Anna's father was involved in the Underground Railroad, for she also writes,
"Many escaped slaves lived with families in Hopedale. My father had a colored man called John who did some of the work around the place, but never went alone from the house. At night he was there. The next morning he was gone. I was too young to be entrusted with important secrets."
Aidan Ballou, the founder and leader of the Practical Christian Socialists here in Hopedale, was dedicated to the abolition of slavery using purely peaceful means. Now, our research here in Hopedale, we're trying to find where the house that Anna Thewig lived, and is it still standing? And of all the ironies here in Hopedale, one of the greatest ones is the fact the most successful component of the Hopedale commune, of all their enterprises, was the manufacturing of the Draper Temple. Now, the temple is a piece of metal that sits in the front of the loom and holds the cloth taut. It is a key component to the successful operation of a loom. That connection to the Southern slave economy is ever present in the Blackstone Valley.
Just by telling their stories, either on the lecture circuit or publishing their narratives of their lives in bondage, they helped to turn opinion against the institution of slavery, because suddenly it wasn't an abstract anymore. When you have people like Frederick Douglass writing My Bondage and My Freedom, and other escaped and freed slaves giving first-person accounts of exactly what their life was like under slavery, there was no question anymore about what the institution was and what we were fighting. There was so much rhetoric from the South saying, you know, slavery is not a bad institution. The slaves enjoy themselves. The slaves are inclined to this style of life for whatever reason. And for the first time in the 1840s and the 1850s, you had slave narratives, free blacks saying in an uncompromising way that, no, this is not our life and this is not what we choose. And you know, and you also had in their eloquence, you talk about Chase or Douglass, simply by the means which they expressed themselves, they demonstrated that they weren't second-class citizens. No one who ever heard Frederick Douglass give a speech ever again assumed that a black had an inferior intelligence to a white. He was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant by all accounts on the lecture circuit, and of course his books remain brilliant. And it's the same for many other black orators and writers of the day.
There's a lot more information out there about the Underground Railroad activity here in the Blackstone Valley than you might expect, but you got to do a little bit of detective work to find it. Hi, I'm Ranger Kevin Kleiberg, and I'm here today at the Riverbend Farm here in the town of Uxbridge, Massachusetts, where I'm looking to find some of those hidden stories about the Underground Railroad. Now, Riverbend Farm was once owned by a man named Charles Capron, and back in the 1820s, his cousins owned much of what's now downtown Uxbridge. They ran a mill downtown where the liquor store is located now, and ran a general store right around the corner. Now, one of the Capron boys, Effingham Capron, managed their Satinette mill. Now, he was also a strict Quaker and worked as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Now, how do we know this? Well, the Reverend Samuel May of Brooklyn, Connecticut, wrote in his memoirs some recollections of our anti-slavery conflict, published in 1869. The Reverend May wrote, "So long as 1834, when I was living in the eastern part of Connecticut, I had fugitives addressed to my care. I helped them on to that excellent man, Ephraim L. Capron, in Uxbridge, afterwards in Worcester, and he forwarded them to secure retreats." We can speculate that the African Americans escaping slavery coming from eastern Connecticut here to Uxbridge would have been traveling along the old Boston to Hartford Turnpike, which is today Route 16 and some parts of Hartford Avenue. Now, Effingham Capron's house was located right in downtown Uxbridge, where today unfortunately stands a gas station and a parking lot. But it was located right along several major transportation routes heading to the north, including both a major roadway, and also right in his backyard was the Blackstone Canal and the towpath running along it. Now, that's a question we've been talking about for a little while amongst the rangers here. Was the Blackstone Canal used as part of the Underground Railroad, helping escaping slaves on their way northwards? It's a great theory. Unfortunately, we haven't found any evidence to either prove or disprove that idea, but it's something that we've been doing some of our own detective work to try to find the answer for. One of the conflicts that the Quaker mill owners here in the north often faced was that they were making their fortune based on the most part on the efforts, the work of those slaves back down on the cotton plantations in the south. This is a paradox that became apparent all throughout New England, and it's even mentioned in a letter that Effingham Capron received from fellow Quaker and abolitionist Elizabeth Buffum Chase, who herself was part of a mill family that ran the mills over in Valley Falls in the town of Cumberland, Rhode Island. Now, the whole Capron family had a Rhode Island connection, which in some ways plays into our study of them as being conductors along the Underground Railroad. The family was originally from the Pawtucket and Cumberland, Rhode Island areas. Once they'd moved here to Uxbridge and they'd set up their mill, they began to look for workers to work in that mill. Many of them were Rhode Islanders hired to come up here who had previously worked at the mills owned by the Slater Company in the Pawtucket or the Slatersville area and had previous experience as being mill hands. One of these men from Rhode Island in particular attracted our attention. Luke Gilson, who worked here for the Capron Mill and is credited with being the inventor and producer of the first power loom for satinette cloth. Now, Gilson also came from Cumberland, Rhode Island, and there are some rumors about his previous house down in Cumberland. The Gilson Thomas Fisk House, also known as the House of Compassion, is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's a significant example of late Georgian domestic architecture with a degree of sophistication rarely found in rural areas. Local lore connects this house with the Underground Railroad. Unfortunately, this connection lacks solid documentation. However, the connection with Effingham Capron of Uxbridge, the noted abolitionist, and Luke Gilson of Cumberland is of great interest. But we need to know more about that connection. Architectural artifacts found on the Gilson site, such as old foundations and even some sort of tunneling system, are very interesting, but without some sort of people connection, showing that the Gilsons had some sort of contact with others who were working as conductors along the Underground Railroad, Those artifacts are unfortunately right now meaningless. You really need to have that people-to-people connection, showing that network of safe houses that would send those escaping slaves up from the south and working their way north to freedom. But part of the fun of this all is doing that detective work and finding those people-to-people connections that can make the stories here come alive.
In attempting to tell the story of Underground Railroad activity in any location in America is indeed a daunting task for the interpretive ranger of the National Park Service. Fortunately, we're not alone in our search for another true story of freedom. We have a host of partners who can help us tell the remarkable story, particularly the remarkable story of the house behind me, the Samuel May Jr. House here in Leicester, Massachusetts. Now, we're on the Becker College campus, and our partners run the gamut from the Leicester Public Library, the Leicester Historical Society, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the wonderful staff and resources of Becker College, but foremost, the family, the May family, scattered throughout America as so many of our families are, but still has remained as a steward of the Samuel May Jr. legacy. And as stewards of that legacy, they've come here to the Blackstone Valley to help us tell our story of Underground Railroad activity right here in the Blackstone Valley. Hey guys. Hello. Glad you could come along.
Hey, Chuck, how are you?
Judd May.
Chuck.
Yeah.
Very nice to see you. Now, you're the great-grandson. Great-grandson, and you're the great-grandson
That's right.
of Samuel
One
May
great.
Jr. Coming back to the house today must bring back a lot of old memories, doesn't it? You've done a lot of the research and a lot of the stewardship in keeping the legacy of Samuel May Jr. alive. After all your reading, can you characterize him for us?
I think so. We're very fortunate because we have a lot of his letters and information written about him, and we can reconstruct quite a bit about him. He was born in Boston in the early 1800s, 1810. His father was a very wealthy Boston merchant who gave him a very good education, and his mother, Mary Goddard May, treated her family and their children as really the center of their universe. She was went to great pains to raise their children in a Christian home, instilling a very strong sense of right and wrong and social consciousness, and I think that that bore fruit, I think, very well later on. It was probably the reason he was so amenable to getting involved in the anti-slavery movement in later life. He became the general agent for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in Boston, and he served in that role from 1847 to 1865. He was really at ground zero in terms of the abolition movement. He was sort of one of the main workhorses, not so well known as Wendell Phillips and Garrison from his oratory standpoint and his writings, but he was instrumental in making a lot of the arrangements for anti-slavery meetings and lectures and setting up lecture halls, and because of that, he had we have many letters of correspondence back and forth between a lot of the abolitionists that were working in the New England area, and because of that, his paper trail is quite prolific.
In the long period that he was living here, he only was a minister in this church for about 12 years. And during that period, the parish, the people that he had in his church, were very much attached to their business of the carding mills here. And they were not at all anxious to impede the movement of the slave owners. And therefore he had a hard time in his congregation to try to win them over to a more humanitarian approach. And it got so severe he finally quit after 12 years and took he moved from here to didn't move, I mean he went to the Brooklyn, Connecticut church and was a minister there for a year before he was called to Boston to be an official of the Anti-Slavery Society.
The thing that perhaps really hit him the worst, or hit his soul the worst, was the fugitive slave law in 1850. And it was really at about that time, 1849 and 50, is when we start seeing documentation that he was participating in the railroad. And although you might think that he would preach nonviolence, but he certainly believed that, but he also believed that in some cases other relatively less nonviolent techniques were appropriate when necessary. There are perhaps a half a dozen documented examples of where he was moving slaves around, not at this house, but there are a number of instances there in some of these slave narratives that talk about ships coming up from the south into South Boston Harbor, and in a number of different times during the middle 1850s rather. There would be a rowboat that would go out to a ship or a schooner, and one or two runaways would be rowed ashore. And on a number of occasions, there was a Samuel May Jr. and a Dr. Cabot who were there to help them. Samuel May oftentimes, it appears, would accompany the runaways on the train to Worcester, and then from there they would be sent farther north along the Underground Railroad to places unknown. We also know that from, I guess, some of the information from the letters of Thomas Wentworth Higginson, he mentions that he had brought slaves periodically to the Abbey Kelly Foster home in the Taconic area of Worcester, and that the next stop from there for many of them was up here at the home of Samuel May and Lester.
Tell us a little bit about the barn here.
Well, I remember as a kid of perhaps 5, 6, 7 years old, my grandfather, Herbert May Sr., showing me an underground cellar that was underneath the wooden floor in the barn over here to the north of the house. And you would enter this cellar by lifting up this large wooden trap door. It was under the south wall of the house, and it was only about 10 feet away from the main entrance where the horse-drawn carriages and perhaps farm animals would have come in and out of the house. And I remember descending down 6 or 7 steps into this very dark, dank, earthy-smelling hole in the ground, basically. It had a very low ceiling in it, and it just made a very vivid impression on me as a kid. It's something I just will never forget. And we don't really know what the original purpose of the cellar was. It's possible it could have been originally dug for the purpose of storing perishable foods. It also would have provided an excellent opportunity to hide runaway slaves as well in a very clandestine way. You could have easily brought a horse-drawn carriage with 2 or 3 runaways in the wagon, pulled it all the way into the barn, and then closed the door, and then outside of sight of anybody else, they could be transferred down into the cellar and then wait for the next opportunity to be put in a wagon and carried farther north to some other location.
The quilt I found simply in the attic of my mother's house, and so knew that it came from Lester. That's all I knew. And I then learned that it was the drunkard's path, and that's all I knew for many years until the book came out, Hidden in Plain View, when suddenly there it was on the front page of USA Today, and our pattern, and I began to realize that there was a whole story about these quilts that I wasn't at all aware of. And what I've learned about this drunkard's path is that it was, there's a theory that's growing in credibility, I think, that these patterns, quite a number of them, had huge significance for the escaping slaves and the Underground Railway, and that it helped the slaves get away and escape to Canada or wherever they were going. What they believe about this particular pattern, other than its being the drunkard's path, is that the escaping slaves believed that evil traveled in straight lines. So there was great safety in going in a zigzag pattern, which is what this pattern represents. And that blue in particular was a color that meant safety or good things. So the color itself is also significant. And what is interesting, I think, and very aesthetic about this particular quilt is the variety of blue and white patterns. You can see that it's a scrap bag quilt because it isn't all uniform, and this pattern is different from this pattern, this pattern, this pattern. There are at least a dozen and maybe many more patterns of blue and white here, so and yet very aesthetically done in the end. We believe that it had a part in showing that this house is part of the Underground Railway because my great-great-grandfather was Secretary General of the Abolition Society here in Massachusetts, and it would make sense that this quilt could either have been shown out a window as a significant element, maybe comings and goings indicating a safe time to come back to the house, or it could have just been given in gratitude for the work that he was doing in helping slaves escape. We'll have to come up with theories on that. I don't know that we'll ever find out exactly why the quilt was here in our house, but we're glad to have it, and we certainly treasure it as part of the story of Samuel May. Once asking my grandfather if he remembered Samuel May, and he said, oh yes. My grandfather remembered that once being in the church over there, the Unitarian church, and seeing Samuel May going down the aisle, shaking his hands and coattails flying, making a point. And for me, that epitomizes much of Samuel May. He was a man with strong feelings, strong beliefs, and he let people know what they were.
So how did Africans escaping slavery find their way to such places as Leicester and Worcester and Uxbridge and Cumberland? Here in New England and parts of the Northeast, it was seaports and coastal areas that were key entry points for fugitive Africans, either as stowaways, hidden as cargo by sympathetic sea captains or sailors, or simply as passengers, placed on board steamers by abolitionists or members of the free African community. For the free African communities played a critical role in this drama of freedom. Providence, New Bedford, Worcester, and Boston all had active African communities that were aggressive in their willingness and ability to protect their own.
I think it was a time of great passion, but also a time of great confusion. And one of the most fascinating aspects of it for me is watching the different cells within the abolitionist movement as they play against each other, pacifist against non-pacifist, revolutionaries against political abolitionists who believed in working in the system, people who were for complete equity with the blacks, and people who wanted to free the blacks but then send them back to Africa. It's interesting to see those forces collide within what is supposedly the same camp. And it gives you if you have that many different agendas on the abolitionist side, you can imagine how many different agendas were in play across the board. I think it was a real intellectual and political quagmire for an individual to find his or her way through.
Well, this is Ranger Chuck Arning of the National Park Service here in the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. It's important for us to remember that the story of the Underground Railroad is a story of freedom, a story of hope based on a future of equality and justice. And it is a story that faith and that hope convinced many Africans to stay in this land, a land not of their own choosing, but the hope that the words of our forefathers, as written in the Declaration of Independence, would someday be true, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator by certain unalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Underground Railroad is America's story, and it's a story we should not and cannot forget.